How Books Work, Real Talk with editors, agents, and publishing insiders. Hosted by writers Julie Satow and Alice Robb. Welcome back to Season 2 of How Books Work. I'm Julie Satow, and I'm here with my co-host Alice Robb, and we couldn't be more excited to be back with another season where we interview publishing insiders you don't usually hear from. This season, we'll be speaking with a ton of experts, from literary agents to speaking agents to foreign rights experts, which is a good segue to discussing today's episode. Foreign rights might be one of the most obtuse parts of an already opaque industry. Did you know, for instance, that half of all books published in Germany are translations, while only 3% of US publications are? Or that UK publishers are now booking their schedules so far in advance that some editors can't take on anything new until 2027? Have you ever had the surreal experience of finally selling a book, then hearing from your agent that it also sold abroad, then months later getting sent your book but with a completely different cover and in a language that you don't understand? How do these deals actually happen? And what determines whether your book finds readers in Italy versus Japan versus nowhere abroad at all? To get answers to these mysteries, we are speaking with Allison Malecha, Director of Foreign Rights at Trellis Literary Management. Allison explains the hidden world of foreign scouts and shares stories of authors who flopped in America but became bestsellers in France. Whether you're curious about advances abroad or wondering why American nonfiction still has such cachet internationally, then this conversation is for you. This is How Books Work, and let's dive in. I am very excited that we are back for Season 2. Hopefully, we will have a lot of interesting people coming on board to discuss how books actually work. How have you been? Good?
Good. Well, as I might explain to our guests, I just got back from a little book tour in Italy, and it made me think a lot about how foreign rights work, because this was for a book that came out over 2 years ago in the US and UK. And then I can't remember exactly when we actually sold the translation rights, but yeah, it came out 2 years later in Italian translation. It's kind of interesting to re-engage with that material that I've actually now written a few years ago at this point, and to see it kind of having this new life. I feel like foreign rights are like this kind of mysterious thing as a writer that you might just wake up to a random email that's like, here's a little bit of extra money. And, then maybe a few years later, you see your book with a different cover. And yeah, I've been curious what is actually going on behind those scenes.
I have to ask you a question. Did you reread the book?
I re-skimmed it on the plane to Milan.
Because do you remember it? I feel like it's sort of like after when I report out a story, once it's out, I kind of can't think about it again. So I don't know how, obviously I've been touring on this same book. So at least the material that was is in my presentation, I'm very familiar with, but it's hard to recall. It was a 350-page book. So what did you do to prepare? I do wonder.
Yeah, I mean, I've still been doing intermittent press. So I wasn't it's not like I hadn't looked at it in 2 years. I find this a lot harder for my first book, because it came out in 2018 and was a lot more research heavy. That was about the science of dreaming. And that one I actually do have to almost study for it if I'm going to do an interview. Don't think, dear, the one that just came out in Italian, because it's more personal. It was more just kind of weird to reread, these sections that were kind of in the present tense 3 years ago when I wrote them. Kind of like a snapshot of a slightly different time in life.
I'm so excited. Allison is in the waiting room, so I think we're going to let her in. Are we ready to let her in? Hi, Allison.
It's great to be here with you both.
Yeah, we're so excited. So I guess we just wanted to start out with the most basic question, which is, how did you get into foreign rights?
Yeah, it's a good one. And my path has been probably a little bit unusual for foreign rights people. Kind of snuck in through the back door. I started out in domestic editorial, working at an independent publishing house. And I held a few different jobs there, but ultimately worked for the publisher, who was really connected within the international publishing community. would go to the London Book Fair and the Frankfurt Book Fair every year. Those are the two big international book fairs that the foreign rights world kind of organizes itself around, at least on the adult side. And he also published a lot in translation, sold a lot of books in translation. So I kind of got a tiny little window through that seat into the foreign rights world. But as so many people in publishing, I also just, had kind of seen out my time, and my first publishing job was a little bit burnt out, frankly, and ended up with an opportunity to apply for a scouting job, which was not something that was on my radar. And scouting is this kind of like obscure part of publishing that you may or may not know much about, listeners may or may not know much about. But basically, scouts are kind of the consultants of the publishing world, and they tend to be small agencies that are either foreign focused or film and TV focused. Some do both. And they work for clients either abroad or in Hollywood to kind of help their clients buy the best and hottest projects from American publishing. And so that's kind of how I ended up in the foreign rights world more broadly. Is I went to go work for a scouting agency called Bettina Shreva Literary Scouting. At that agency, I worked for publishers in over 20 territories, also did work for a small film client. And that's really kind of how I got to know the international publishing community. Is what I've said about scouting, does that make sense so far? Should I elaborate on any of that?
Yeah, I'd love you to elaborate. I mean, I guess, so do you work the same way as like a CAA film agent would, book to TV kind of film agent would, or something? Or
No.
Yeah.
So a scout is basically paid that they're paid on retainer, like a consultant would be, by their clients. So for example, the scouting agency that I worked for, among their clients were Penguin Random House UK and Penguin Random House Germany. And so those publishers paid the scouting agency kind of on a, quarterly, I actually don't know what the financials were, basis. And that was to basically like be their eyes and ears on the ground in American publishing, and to tell them, like, you, editor in this division at PRH UK, should be paying attention to this hot book project from the US because it's perfect for your list. It's the kind of thing you publish really well. And so I'm kind of like helping give you a leg up to buy that project. And same for the people who do it for the film and TV world, but I was much more foreign focused, and that's kind of how I ended up in the foreign rights world.
So the big publishers don't have their own like in-house foreign foreign department. I mean, I would think
they do, so now I am a foreign rights director at a literary agency, and the foreign rights people's job is to sell. We're sellers, like a literary agent is. You sell projects from your kind of stable of projects and authors to foreign publishers, and that's all like outgoing in a way. And so these foreign publishing houses, like Penguin Random House UK and Penguin Random House Germany, they do have foreign rights teams, but those foreign rights teams are responsible for selling Penguin Random House UK projects to US publishers or to German publishers. Same with Penguin Random House Germany. They sell Penguin Random House Germany authors to the UK, to the US, around the rest of the world. They aren't really in charge of like bringing projects in. And the editors who work there are publishing from the US and from around the rest of the world is a big business for a lot of foreign publishers. But they're not on the ground in the US talking to US editors and US agents all the time. So basically they're paying for scouts are basically the liaisons between a foreign publisher and the US publishing market. So that was what I did for a few years before coming to Trellis to become a director of foreign rights and work on that selling side for the first time. And so now at Trellis, Trellis is a pretty new agency. So I joined the founding team of the agency in fall 2021 and was brought in from having been a scout to build the foreign rights department here at Trellis and to start selling our authors' books to foreign publishers.
That's very clarifying. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I would not have known any of that.
It's a complicated little part of the publishing world, which is already so complicated.
Which is why we have this podcast. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
And do you have like a background in other languages, or like how do you get to know all these different markets?
That's a really good question. And I think there is, it is helpful to speak foreign languages if you're in the foreign rights world, but it's really not necessary if English is your first language, because basically English ends up being the lingua franca of the whole foreign rights world, which is very, kind of clarifying about, in a big way, American cultural imperialism and like the reach of that most foreign rights business around the world is done in English. And so I was at the London Book Fair, which, as I briefly said earlier, is one of two big international book fairs, like trade shows, basically, that happen for international publishing in a calendar year. And those fairs look like, for me and for the editors who attend, basically being in a huge, airless, lifeless conference room for a few days and having like half-hour meetings with people from all over the world. And most of those meetings take place in English. So I do read French. I speak it, although not as well as I would love to. I also studied Czech in college, but I've used those languages very little because most of the French and Czech editors I deal with or would be in touch with speak much better English than I do their languages. And it just ends up being the kind of language that the whole international publishing, like all of the international publishing dealings, tend to happen in English.
You mentioned the London Book Fair. I'm just curious. So obviously that just happened. The news I've been seeing is, like I mentioned to Alice earlier, was mostly about sort of how can we get nonfiction to be more robust once again. And I should say Alice and I mostly, right, Alice is working on something that's fiction, but mostly we're nonfiction writers. So our podcast mostly focuses on nonfiction.
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the London Book Fair and how it was and how the market is, and I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think, with all that's been happening politically in the US and in the world heading, at the start of this year, it was certainly interesting to see what the mood would be like and the conversations would be like going and being amongst international publishers for a few days. And I think everybody had the same feeling that ultimately it was a pretty good vibes fair. Everybody was kind of like, everybody from every corner is dealing with their own political situation at the moment. And there was kind of this feeling of like a gratitude that we get to all be together and talk about books and share books, and that books are part of how we navigate tough times. So there was this kind of like good mood despite it all at the London Book Fair. Certainly, I think as you have probably touched on in other episodes and thought about and talked about yourselves, publishing is so cyclical, and right now really commercial fiction and genre fiction are having their moment in the sun, and nonfiction has been a bit tougher in the last couple of years, but that will change, and it always does. And in the meantime, there is still nonfiction that's selling, and some really great nonfiction that's selling. And actually, for our agency, one of our books of the fair ended up being a nonfiction proposal about deserts, which people, I think, just found like a lot of like comfort and wonder and hopefulness in. So I think there are always the exceptions, and then there's always the long view that kind of like these trends will come and go. And I do think that when political times are tough, nonfiction often is what people turn to. I think it's maybe different kinds of nonfiction than might be turned to in other moments. But I think right now, at the London Book Fair, there was a lot of talk about certain kinds of political books figuring out how to talk about Elon Musk, for example, books about how to talk about AI, but also nonfiction that kind of like has big ideas, or like, helps you think about the priorities in your life, helps you think about how to take care of yourself, helps you think about how to make community in tough times. I think sort of the like best and most universal messages in that kind of like big idea space, which can sometimes be more like prescriptive, sometimes is more thinky. But I think those books have done well for quite a few years and continue to do well and find their audiences both domestically and abroad.
UK editor said to me a couple of years ago that she had found that like she's a nonfiction editor, that she had found that like since 2016, the US and UK markets had kind of diverged, that there used to be a lot more overlap. And if something was a bestseller in the US, it would probably do well in the UK, and that was kind of like less reliable now. Is that something that you found, or that you can continues to be true?
I have heard that too. At the same time, I think sometimes there's like, often the American publishing market is kind of leading in trends, and trend I like define very broadly, not just to be like, books on exercise, but kind of like also the kind of writing and the kinds of people doing the writing. And sometimes there's a bit of a like hurry up and wait for the rest of the world kind of moment. And I think, something that I've heard serious nonfiction editors in the UK say is that they feel like a certain kind of narrative nonfiction, especially kind of like history, stopped working as well in the US a few years ago, and now is starting to not work as well in the UK, but kind of like had a longer life in the UK. But and like I think like the US has, there's like a lot of talk right now about who counts as an expert, and like expert driven nonfiction is kind of leading the way, but like a journalist can still be an expert. And I was talking with the UK editor of James Nestor's Breath, which has been a huge bestseller, like in a long way in the UK as well. I think she said it still sells like 100,000 copies a year for them, which is incredible. And she was like, he's not a respiratory doctor. Like he's not an expert in a traditional sense, but he is an expert in terms of being a journalist with a lot of integrity and like who has spent the time to really do the research. And so that is something that readers are paying attention to. And so I think like I have found the US led in this, and now the UK is doing similarly, like kind of defining the expertise of the author. And like readers, I think, are really looking to find an expert, and in some ways, like that kind of can matter more than like sometimes that's wrapped up in like a social media platform that people trust, but sometimes someone having an expertise as a doctor can offset the fact that they might not have a social media platform. I don't know that I'm explaining this well, but like I think like what counts to make a nonfiction writer like really attractive and to make their reach something saleable, I think is something that's changing right now in both the US and the UK. And I think there has been sort of disparity the last few years between the two markets and who they look to write their nonfiction. But I think that's perhaps evening out a little bit right now.
So interesting. You mean because the credibility of like news has been called into question so much? Is that what you're sort of getting at? Like, or
one part of it, okay. Certainly. I think also, I think,
New York Times staff writer isn't necessarily carrying the same weight as maybe it once was, something like that.
I think that's true. And I think, I think thinking about the difference between the US and UK markets, like I think, being a New Yorker staff writer continues to hold a lot of weight among American publishers. I think those books haven't always like translated over to the UK in terms of readership and sales. And so that might be something that like matters a little bit less to UK publishers. And I also think that UK publishers have found, and this has been true for foreign markets around the world, that it's really useful to have an author on the ground who can do radio, interviews, can do events. And so I think UK publishers are a little bit more careful about the US projects that they take on and the levels at which they invest in them, because they know they aren't going to have that author on the ground to do that in-person promotion. Although, you're an exception, Alice, being on the ground in the UK, which I think is useful.
So both of my books came out in the US and the UK. And with my first book, I was living in New York, but the publication dates were so staggered. I think it came out like 4 months later. So I actually was able to come over and do press here. Whereas when my second book came out, I actually lived in the UK, but I was doing press. I was prioritizing the American press. So I actually couldn't really do much here because they came out within 2 days of each other.
Yeah, that's also another thing that's changed a lot in the last few years is whether the UK or the US publication was the primary one. There used to be much more staggering between the two. But, in part because of Amazon and in part because of export editions, much more often the US and UK publications are going simultaneously now. And I think that does make it tougher for authors sometimes, and tougher for like if the US publication is the primary one, for the UK publication to have real momentum to like build off of. But part of that is because of the way Amazon works, which is the answer to a lot of the ways that publishing changes. But if there's a staggering between the US and UK publications, and like the primary one starts to really take off, even if it's not supposed to appear in that market, it's really hard for the secondary publication to like get their search terms, like to get their edition to show up first in the search in their own market, because of the way that Amazon will like kind of create primacy for a book that's selling copies. I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but there's something with Amazon search terms where basically they will bury the original edition if the other one is already.
I thought Amazon, like Amazon UK, is different from Amazon US or whatever.
It's supposed to be, but
not totally.
It's not. Some of that stuff works. Some of that stuff doesn't follow the rules that the publishers would like it to.
What about advances? I mean, my UK version, basically I published with a publisher that's like relatively new in the nonfiction space, I guess. Canelo. It's anyway, so I didn't actually get an advance. I got like royalties, which was different. And from what Alice says and stuff, and I don't have a ton of experience because this was my first book that sold in the UK, because my first book did not, is that, advances tend to be significantly smaller anyway in foreign markets than compared to the US. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that works financially. And is that true also for UK or Italian or whatever authors too, that's the case? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the US advance tends to be the largest. And if a book sells in a competitive way in the US and is able to do a bunch of foreign deals, oftentimes if I can do a really good set of foreign deals right up front for a book that's sold in a big way in the US, that still adds up to like all of those foreign deals together tends to add up to still like, a quarter at the very most, maybe half of what the US advances. UK advances tend to be much smaller than US advances. And sometimes that makes it a bit awkward because sometimes it's, for a UK author, if they're getting a really competitive US and UK advance, their UK editor, they kind of think of as their primary editor, but the US editor might have a much larger financial investment in the project. So, it might like a big UK advance is 6 figures and a big US advance, 6 figures is a lot in the US, but that can go much more across the spread of 6 figures up to 7 figures. A 7-figure UK advance is like a very, 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 very rare thing. So, and I think, for US authors, often the biggest, if they're getting a number of foreign deals, often the biggest one will be the UK deal. Germany can also be a big one, although the German market is having a complicated relationship with English language translation at the moment. Italy has also been big for us sometimes. But oftentimes it's like, the foreign deals are like an aggregate, and in aggregate can make a difference financially for an author, but it's much more of a volume business. You kind of hope to get as many foreign deals as possible. And each of those foreign deals represents a totally other market, that is possible to have a different kind of publication in. It's helpful if the book works in the US, and then, the other foreign territories can ride that momentum. But sometimes the book doesn't work in the US, doesn't work in the UK, and really works in France. And that's like kind of wonderful to see. And that's part of what, the foreign rights team tries to help feed is all these different possibilities for a book's life.
This is probably like too broad a question, but I'm just curious, whatever you can say about, if you can generalize about like what makes a book take off in a foreign market, or are there any case studies you can think of where like a book kind of didn't take off in the US, but then had some huge moment in France?
Yeah. My examples are more on the fiction side, so I'm sorry for that. My like classic France example is, and the French market has since changed a little bit, but when I was working in editorial, I worked on a lot of literary mystery fiction and like literary noir. And a lot of the authors on that list that I worked on sold very modestly in the US, often didn't have UK publishers, but often had a very dedicated French publisher who did very well with them. And that's just because that's a genre that has had more of a robust life in France than in the US more recently. And so a lot of those authors kind of like had this wonderful French publishing life that felt very, very separate from their US one. I also remember actually in the kind of crime fiction space, I worked with this author whose book had not really, again, worked at all in the US or the UK, but went huge in Japan. And he talked about being very small potatoes for his US and UK publisher, but he had gotten like an option in Japan for I think his book was turned into a Japanese film. And he talked about being brought there for a book tour and arriving and being like picked up by a limo at the airport. And he was just like, oh my gosh, me, ex author, the version of myself that lives in Japan is living a very different life than the author in the US or the UK. So yeah, those are some fiction examples. I mean, there's also there was this novel published last year, I think, in the US. It's a second novel called Wellness by, I think Nathan Hill is the author. I have not read it. And I think he's a big author in the US. I think he's done well. I think that book has done well in the US, but it has really taken off in some foreign territories. And his French publisher was telling me, I think, she sold like 80,000 copies or something of that book. And she kind of put it up to it being the kind of like big American family novel that a foreign reader will look to kind of like understand America right now. And so I think it's had, not that it hasn't been successful here, and I have not looked up the numbers, so I hope I'm not like eating my own words right now, but I think it's a book that has had an outsized impact in some foreign territories because readers are kind of trying to understand what's going on in the US. And that's a book that, for whatever reason, whether that was because of the way it was published in those foreign territories or just the moment it hit in, has ended up being a book readers in those territories are looking to for that kind of explanation and experience. Yeah, those are a few of the examples that come to mind.
Yeah, I just wonder,
Yeah.
is there anything that writers should keep in mind when they're thinking about, like, I mean, I know obviously this is also quite broad, but like, are there stereotypical things that, let's say German readers or UK readers respond to, or things that we often think, or I often think about the US market and like where readers are, what they're interested in when I'm thinking about my new book idea or whatever. But I'm just curious if like, there's anything we should keep in mind from the US perspective looking outward,
That's a really good question. I think it's hard to write to
the market.
a market that also is so broad. For example, my colleague and I sold a book about addiction medicine last fall by a wonderful doctor. She's an addiction medicine thought leader. And we sold it competitively in the US, also competitively in the UK. And once that UK editor was on board, kind of got the author to think a bit more about like, the medical system in the US is so particular, as we all no doubt will be aware of. And the way we interact with health insurance, with all these different things is very particular. So for her kind of approaching the book, knowing that she was going to have at least, a foreign readership in at least one place, that has meant trying to pull a broader array of statistics. So if she's, citing statistics about alcoholism in the US, maybe also finding a UK or a European statistic to go along with it, kind of citing trends in a way that like either is complicated by what's happening abroad versus here, or that shows like more of a global trend. And in general, kind of like thinking about the more universal takeaways. So like a lot of this book is kind of about how families can deal with, when they have someone who has substance use disorder within their family, like the kind of myths and misconceptions that are commonly held by families everywhere. And so those kind of larger universal takeaways versus being like very nitty gritty about health insurance in the US, for example. I think so much depends also on the kind of book you're writing, and like not every book that is worthwhile and like will have a readership in the US needs to have a readership abroad. Like there are really wonderful books about, the US judicial system or about health insurance or about like, certain communities in the US that just might, they don't need to have a foreign readership. They don't need to be written with that in mind. And any book that works in a huge way in the US, whether that in terms of book sales or in terms of, prize and critical attention, probably will find a few foreign publishers anyways. But I think I think if you do have a book that you feel like can have foreign appeal and you want to keep that in mind, I think it's just, if you are citing research, to be citing research not just from the US, if that's applicable and if that's findable, and to be thinking about, some of the more universal takeaways that might not just apply to American readers.
Do you ever have to deal with authors getting like really conflicting notes from their American and British editors?
Hopefully the idea is not to, but certainly that can happen sometimes. Or I think sometimes there are competing interests where the UK or Australian editor wants, more emphasis put on Y, or wants the author to spend more time citing research from the UK or from Australia, and the US editor, does not care as much about that. I mean, when we think about matching up, creating partnerships for our authors with both US and UK editors, we try to do so in a in a way that will work for everybody. And, we try to make sure that the US and the UK editor are in touch and can collaborate in a way that makes things easiest for the author. A lot of that depends on the US and UK editors involved as well. Like, I think I find that there are a lot of editors who do work really well together. And I think if, for example, for the addiction book that I just mentioned, we were deciding between a few different final bidders in the UK, and the US editor had a preference for one because they'd worked together before and knew that they would work well together and felt like they were, had similar visions for the book. So that's something that we ultimately took into account, and we did end up going with that editor. So I think it's, hopefully, ideally you have a team who's helping you think about these things and kind of making the best match in the UK, not only for, money and investment level, but also for like who will be the best person to have as part of the publishing picture. And I've certainly had cases too where, the UK editor brings something to the table that the US editor doesn't, whether that maybe the UK editor is a more senior person who has more blurb connections or has something editorially that they can bring to the table that the US editor doesn't have. And I think those to me are the most exciting partnerships across the US and the UK, when they can kind of complement each other in that way.
That's interesting, because I just wonder, so are most of the deals done in at the same time that you're also doing, a book sale in the US, or are they often done after publication, or does it just depend?
For the UK, we really try to get a deal up front as close to the US sale as possible. This is something that's also been changing the last few years. I think it used to be a lot more possible to sell UK rights further along the publication journey in the US. But UK publishers kind of since COVID have been planning out their schedules and their years a lot more in advance and leaving less drop-in spots available. So, for example, at the London Book Fair, I met with a ton of UK editors, and we have a few 2026 books that don't have UK publishers that I was still talking about. And I had more than one editor say to me, I can't publish anything before 2027. Like, if it has a 2026 pub date in the US, unless it's going to be a #1 New York Times bestseller, like, I don't have space for it. So that, I think more largely UK editors are looking to get involved at an early stage with the US publication. That said, there are always the exceptions. There are always the books that end up getting dropped in later. For example, again, this is a fiction example, but, Allison Espach's The Wedding People, which did so well here last year, has done well abroad, found its UK publisher further along that publication timeline. And the UK publisher kind of came in much closer to pub, and it worked because the book really, really worked here. There was a lot of momentum to go off of, and the UK publisher was able to kind of make it a priority and move things around to make that publication happen. So there are always the exceptions, but I think we always try to bring a UK publisher on board at the point of sale in the US. And that means, when there's for nonfiction at the proposal stage for a nonfiction project. And again, try to find someone whose vision aligns for the book that will be shaped from that point on with the US publisher.
This is more of just like a comment. I don't know if it's really a question, but I think that it's rare, at least in nonfiction rather, I think, to for, a German book, let's say, to be making huge inroads here in the US market, right? Or, I don't know. And I think that is changing. I just read an interview earlier about Netflix and how the head of Netflix is spending 40% of his time now traveling abroad because so much of the content is not US based. They're buying all these shows from abroad. So maybe that'll change, or maybe that already is changing in the US market. Yeah. But you were talking about being so myopic, English is the lingua franca of the book world. I think it's been somewhat similar, right? From the actual US book market perspective, where we're the big, the big presence and the foreign books are less. So I don't know, is that shifting a little bit? Is it equalizing? I don't know. I'm just curious.
It is. That's a really good question. I think it is shifting and has been for the last several years, where I think for a number of different reasons, US and UK books have become less pervasive in foreign markets, and a lot of foreign publishers are looking further afield. And part of that is just wanting different kinds of voices on their list, part of that is where the trends have gone. The huge trend the last couple of years in fiction for certain kinds of books from Korea and Japan. There was like a New York Times article about healing fiction. That's the category, but that has actually translated to some nonfiction from those territories also coming back to the US and UK, but also, being published around the world. So I do think there's been a diversification in foreign rights the last few years of publishers from everywhere looking everywhere rather than just to the US and the UK first. That said, US and UK books still tend to be really important for foreign publishers' bottom lines. And I think, just to give a sense of the way that, a publishing market is made up, in the US, this is an old statistic and one that I have heard, should be recast or refigured out. But the general statistic is that 3% of the books published in the US are books in translation. In Germany, for example, there has been more investment the last few years, like in native German authors, but still about half of the books published in Germany are books in translation. So that's just a huge, they are looking to bring in so much more than American publishers are bringing in. I think about also like Norway. They are a place where American and English, like Anglophile fiction or Anglophile books are a bit on the wane, but like 10% of their market used to be Anglophile books in translation in Norwegian. Now that's about 3%. But that's still like 3% just from the US and UK or, other English speaking territories, versus in the US, we have 3% total from all over the rest of the world. So it just gives you a sense of like business wise, how much different that is for the publishers when they're thinking about their publishing schedule, their publishing lineup, and their own.
Super interesting.
And one thing that came to mind that I just wanted to add to an earlier point, especially for nonfiction, is when foreign publishers are thinking about nonfiction from the US, a big part of what matters is the tradition of high quality writing in nonfiction. Like American journalists, American narrative nonfiction writers are still seen as the best of the best around the rest of the world. There's such a tradition here for long form journalism, for like real like literary writing in the nonfiction space. And I think over the last several years, other, publishers in other parts of the world have been looking for home authors who can replicate that. But just tradition wise, in terms of the kind of writing produced, the US is still kind of seen as like the leader in that area. So I think that's something that like those really, important narrative nonfiction books and like best in class narrative nonfiction writers and journalists from the US will still find their homes abroad because they're still the best of the best that there are.
I did not know that American journalists had that reputation. I feel so beat up as an American journalist right now. Not at all seen that way. It's very edifying.
I noticed that a little bit living in the UK, just that there are so many fewer outlets for long form journalism because there's just less money in the ecosystem here, and that kind of writing is so expensive to produce. There isn't really a New Yorker equivalent here.
Well, this is amazing. We are so grateful for all this incredible information that I certainly did not know. I feel like, it's something that more of us should think about, especially like I'm just thinking as we're talking, I am finalizing my proposal for my new book. And I'm like, I need to email my agent about foreign rights now. I wouldn't have thought about that. This is really, really helpful and so interesting to think about just kind of that global perspective, because we are maybe less so for you, Alice, since you are abroad. But I think certainly for me and a lot of my friends, we are quite, US focused and myopic in the way we think about it. And yeah, even when we get foreign rights deals, it typically isn't considered like our main, probably because the money is a lot less,
Yes, I feel like it's, any foreign rights deal I can bring to an author is like the cherry on top. It's the gravy. And sometimes that can work out, really well for the author in the end. Sometimes it can have a real financial benefit, but mostly it's just knowing that your book will get to be read by a whole other readership than it would have otherwise.
Okay, I have one more question.
Oh, okay, go for it.
What's your favorite thing about your job?
That's a really good question. I think I really love the people. Like the foreign rights world is a really like collaborative and warm and, book nerdy group of people. Like it's especially because I came to Trellis and was setting up a foreign rights department here. I found other foreign rights people to be so welcoming and so just generous and offering me a tutorial on how to do the tax forms that are really complicated for the foreign rights side, but also like to just share knowledge. And like I think it's I think not that foreign rights can't be competitive in its own way, but in comparison to some other parts of publishing, there's a real like we're part of all. If all boats rise, whatever that saying is, we are all in it together, and I really like that, and I like being able to offer authors, to be their translator, if you will, from a really thorny and complicated part of the publishing world, and being able to kind of like demystify it for them. So I like that I get to be in touch with my colleagues, authors across the board, and just like the people aspect of it on all sides is
That's such a nice way to end.
Thank you both. I hope that helped a little bit.
Oh my God, it was amazing.
Any sense of it, but
no,
it's great to chat with you both.
Yeah, that's incredible. I guess like if any of the audience members has questions, they can just I don't know. Is there a way to reach you? Are you ever on social media or anything like that? Or
Instagram, but if anybody has questions, feel free to email me. I'm always happy to answer what.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Thanks for listening. This has been an episode of How Books Work. Join us on our next episode as we continue to explore publishing behind the scenes.